This is Arietta of Spirits, something a little bit different for this channel since I normally cover lots of RPGs, shooters, things like that. This is neither one of those things and is instead an action-adventure that is very reminiscent of your earlier Zelda games. In fact, it has quite a lot in common with something like Zelda: A Link to the Past. This is a pretty small game. It should only take you about 4 to 5 hours or so to beat, and is very heavily story-driven. So let's obviously start with the story. The story is actually pretty good in my opinion. It's quite a cute game, it's fairly lighthearted, but it does have its moments. The story focuses on a girl that finds herself bound to this sort of spirit being and able to see both the world of the living and the world of spirits at the same time, and it becomes her duty to help to guide these spirits on to the next world, to solve whatever problems it is that are keeping them here. It's not exactly the most original concept, you could say. There are lots of other games and even stuff like anime and things that have taken this concept, but it is actually done pretty well here because, like I said, the story is very important to the game. It is entirely a very story-driven, sort of linear experience, and it's quite cute. I think very important to a very story-driven experience like this is the dialogue, because you can have as good of a lore as you want to, the backstory to your world, but if the actual interactions between the characters aren't enjoyable or interesting, then that doesn't matter as much. And in this case, the character interactions are actually pretty interesting. The dialogue is nicely written, it's well presented, and the overall story takes the place of being cute without being like saccharine sweet, if you know what I mean. It's not cutesy, it's just sort of quaint and adorable. Your main character is thrust into this without really wanting to and has to decide whether or not she wants to actually keep doing it and sort of deal with all of these spirits. And the first spirit that she has to deal with is that of her grandma, her recently deceased grandma, so that makes it extra difficult for her to actually start the journey because she has to deal with something that she's still sort of keeping held in. And I really like that beginning because I think it sets the tone for the rest of the game as this sort of somber experience that's about moving past traumas and moving on from things that are keeping you held down. And it has the obvious sort of allegory of, in real life, making yourself a better person by letting things go and moving on effectively. And that's the kind of lesson that I always enjoy in games because I don't know if everyone realizes how important and useful a lesson in real life that actually is and how difficult it can really be. So I always like it when it's done well, and I do definitely enjoy this game's cute, somber, spirit world take on that concept. Now, how about the gameplay itself? Now, even though this game very clearly has a lot of DNA from A Link to the Past in it, gameplay-wise, it's not that similar because there aren't dungeons or puzzles to solve in like classic Zelda style. I think a lot of the A Link to the Past DNA comes from the overall feel of the game, the sort of layout of the world you're in, and definitely the sound design. Even simple things like picking up hearts off the ground or using the in-game menus and stuff, they all have a very familiar Zelda-ish sound. They're very clearly inspired by that. And gameplay-wise, you're split pretty evenly between two things: combat and exploration. The combat itself is pretty simple, but it does the job. It is a basic sort of swing your sword kind of action, and it doesn't have anything more complicated than that. No spells or special moves to learn, although you do eventually get a shield that allows you to block things, and also you have to use the shield on some enemies in order to actually make them vulnerable. The different later game enemies have more complex aspect to their combat. It starts off quite simple, but it does get a little more complicated later on. It does also have a dodge roll, but do bear in mind, by the way, that this dodge roll does not have immunity frames, or at least not that I could tell, so you cannot use it to roll through enemies or through attacks. It's more about moving yourself away from attacks than it is rolling through them, so use it accordingly. You can also find these things called roamer cores after beating bosses, and you can equip these cores from the pause menu, and you can kill roamer type enemies, which are enemies in this spirit world. They're the more difficult enemies that you'll face rather than the normal like animals. And roamers drop this essence when they're killed, and if you have a core equipped, you will absorb this essence into the core, and whenever the core gets full, you can open it up and it will give you a full heal as well as a permanent +1 heart upgrade, and there are 3 of these cores for you to find. Like I said, generally you find them after defeating bosses. I do like that the overall combat difficulty does increase later on in the game, even though it's a very simple combat system. The fact that the later, more advanced forms of roamers that you'll be facing late in the game actually do have several different attacks to learn and some extra patterns to deal with, and certain like shields and other elements that you have to use some of your other stuff like your shield to actually negate to be able to attack them, or wait for them to teleport around and stuff like that. It just, you know, the combat gets a little bit more complicated. It gets harder than just walk up to thing and smack thing, which I enjoy, because even though this game is very much not focused on the combat, it is a larger part of it because you're doing a lot of exploration and you're going to be finding a lot of enemies while you explore. So it's nice that the later variants of those enemies do actually have some strategy needed to beat them. And the other half of the game, aside from the combat, is of course the exploration, and this is, in my opinion, where the game really shines. Since you can see both worlds at the same time, you'll occasionally come across some pretty unique areas that have some fading in and out of things that maybe shouldn't be there, and some past people that are still doing current work as ghosts and things like that, and it's of course your job to solve their woes and help them move on. So the fact that the game is very focused on exploration really helps with the idea that you're this sort of lost girl trying to figure out what to do with this new power that you don't know if you even want. The exploration is actually pretty atmospheric, I think partially because the pixel art for the game is quite detailed and has a nice sense of like wind and just general atmosphere that gives the exploration a nice feeling, as well as the fact that you'll find yourself in darker areas like caves and things a lot, and these caves are lit up by your spirit companion instead of the usual way like a torch or a lantern, so that gives everything this sort of haunting blue glow that doesn't travel too far, so it gives the underground and cave exploration sort of a unique atmosphere that's a little bit creepy but not outright horror, and is sort of a bit magical while still being grounded in what the game's real world is. Since you can see both the spirit and real world at once, you never really know exactly what you're looking at when it comes to new NPCs and new areas, and if this thing, this building that you're seeing, is actually supposed to be there or not. There are also a couple of overarching side quests, like a pretty large scavenger hunt that you have to do, as well as finding these cute little creatures, and this brings me to the fact that the game actually has quite a few secrets and side areas that you can find. I mentioned the game is linear, and it is linear in a story perspective, but there are a lot of side paths, extra caves and bits that you can find and unlock, and lots of breakable walls and things for you to find, so that you can find some of these secret areas to get items for the scavenger hunt list, or find some of these other creatures to save as part of your side quests. And that's obviously something that's generally just a very good thing for a very heavily exploration-based game, is having more than just the linear path to explore around. Having these side areas, these secrets to find and stuff does help, and it also helps to flesh out the world a little bit because, well, when you're basing your game around exploration, having a larger world gives it a bigger sense of belonging and helps you understand more about, I guess it gives you more context for you're on an island, and what each part of the island actually is, and who used to live there, and what some of these old structures are and stuff like that. When a game is based around exploration like this, it helps to have these extra off the beaten path areas to find that give you a better sense of where you are, you know what I mean? It gives you a context for this area you're in, so it's not just that you're on like a straight line path. You also get to see some older and less traveled parts of the island as well to give you more context for what this place actually is. And that's effectively how the game works. You'll be moving around, exploring this island as much as possible, and finding various NPCs, some of them alive, some of them spirits, and helping to solve their problems by delivering them items or killing certain enemies for them or defeating bosses, and going back to them, and it will help you progress to the next area, sometimes giving you an entirely new tool to use. Again, it's very Zelda stylish, like your fancier sword or your big shield from the ring that you get later, and some stuff like that. The bosses themselves are actually surprisingly challenging from what you might expect for a game with relatively simple combat. The bosses are quite fun because they tend to last a fairly long time, and they tend to have multiple phases of several attacks to learn, and that's just the kind of thing that I enjoy out of my bosses. So the bosses, even though the combat doesn't feel all that Zelda-like, the bosses actually do, and that's actually kind of a cool thing because it helps them feel a bit alien, a bit more threatening, like they're supposed to be these big crazy roamer things that like feed off of human emotion and stuff like that, so they're meant to be a bit scary, and I enjoy the fact that the game actually makes them a threat to you by making their combat a little bit more difficult to get across the fact that these aren't things that you want to mess around with. Overall, it's a pretty short but sweet experience, and if you're looking for a good action adventure, I'd say it's worth a try. It's got very pretty music, it's got a very nice art style to it, and it's got a really genuinely quite good story that's very well written and has fun characters, and is overall a fun time. Like I said, about 4 to 5 hours to beat this one or so, and I think that's actually pretty okay, because sometimes you're just looking for a shorter form experience. I know I cover a lot of RPGs and things like that on this channel, things that you can sink, you know, dozens, maybe even hundreds of hours into, so sometimes it's nice to take a look at something a little bit smaller, a little bit lighter, but still worth your time. So thank you guys very much for watching. The link will of course be in the description below this video if you'd like to check it out for yourself, and I'll see you next time.